You're 14 years old, standing in the atrium of your father's house. Your hair has just been parted with the tip of a spear, the Des Haster Calabaris, an ancient ritual whose symbolism you're only beginning to understand. Through the doorway, you can hear them gathering. Your father's political allies, your future husband's family, the hired musicians who will lead the procession. In a few hours, you'll walk through Rome's streets, surrounded by strangers singing obscene songs about your wedding night. You'll be carried over the threshold of a house you've never entered, and in that house, in front of witnesses, you'll speak words that legally erase your old identity and bind you to a man your father chose. A man who is 32 years old, a man you've met twice. This isn't a tragedy. This is a Tuesday in the Roman Republic. And what makes it so disturbing isn't that it happened in secret. It's that it happened in public, celebrated, legislated, and so thoroughly woven into the fabric of civilization that centuries later, when we talk about the glory of Rome, we conveniently forget what that glory was built upon. Welcome to the historical archives. This is the story of how one empire turned marriage into a machine for social control, how ritual law and religion combined to transform consent into performance, and how the architectural design of a single night could break down a person's autonomy so completely that resistance became unthinkable. By the end of this, you'll understand why historians now study Roman marriage not as romance, but as a system of institutional coercion. You'll see how power doesn't just express itself through conquest and slavery, but through the intimate moments that societies call sacred. And you'll never look at the phrase, traditional marriage, the same way again. Let's start with the law. Because in Rome, everything began with law. Under Roman legal codes dating back to the 12 Tables, a girl could be legally married at age 12. Not an adult at 12. Not granted autonomy or legal personhood at 12. Just marriageable. The technical term was anni nubilis, the age fit for marriage. For boys it was 14. The asymmetry wasn't accidental. It was the entire point. Epitaph evidence from the late Republic and early Empire shows significant variation. But one pattern holds. Elite families often married daughters young to secure alliances before rival families could. One demographic study of funerary inscriptions found elite women's first marriages clustering in the early to mid-teens, with grooms typically a decade or more older. Some girls married younger, some waited until their late teens. But the legal framework permitted, and in many cases incentivized, unions between children and adult men. Now, Roman jurists love to talk about consensus. The idea that marriage required mutual agreement. The legal scholar Ulpian wrote extensively about how both parties had to consent to the union. It sounds almost enlightened. It sounds like Rome understood something fundamental about human dignity. But here's what consensus actually meant in practice. Imagine you're that 14-year-old girl. Your father is the paterfamilias, the head of the household. Under the doctrine of patria potestas, his legal authority over you is almost absolute. He controls your property, your social status, your future. In the Archaic period, this power theoretically extended to life and death, though by the late Republic, that was more symbolic than practiced. But symbolic power is still power. When the man who controls every aspect of your existence tells you that you will marry his political ally's son, what does consent even mean? You say yes because saying no isn't truly an option. You perform agreement because refusal could mean social death, family dishonor, or complete disinheritance. The law required your consent. But the law also ensured that your consent existed within a system so fundamentally coercive that the word lost all meaning. This is what made Roman marriage so insidious. It wasn't openly violent. It was architecturally violent. The coercion was built into the structure itself. Let's talk about cum manu marriage, with hand, meaning under control. In this arrangement, the bride passed from her father's es manus to her husband's manus. The legal language is revealing. It's the same terminology used for transferring property. She wasn't technically a slave. Roman law was very clear about that distinction. But listen to how the jurists described it. She moved from one man's power to another's. Any inheritance she received became her husband's. Any property his. Legally, she ceased to exist as a member of her birth family and was absorbed entirely into his. Now, it's true that by the late Republic, a different form called assign manu became increasingly common, giving women more legal independence. Some women retained control of their property. Some had greater autonomy. But we're focusing on the earlier system because those rituals, those deeply symbolic performances of submission, cast a shadow that lasted for centuries. Even when the law evolved, the ceremonies remained, and the ceremonies told a different story than the legal reforms. The wedding ritual began the night before, with a transformation. The bride's hair was parted using the point of a spear. Ancient sources, Ovid, Plutarch, Festus, all mention these hasta calibaris, though they disagree on the exact symbolism. Some say it invoked Juno, goddess of marriage. Some say it echoed the brides of Rome's first soldiers. But the image is unmistakable, the tool of war, the instrument of conquest, used to prepare a girl for marriage. Her hair was then woven into 6 braids, the senicrines, a style associated with the Vestal Virgins, those women who lived under absolute sexual prohibition. The bride wore white, this tunica recta, woven on an archaic loom. Everything about her appearance marked her as liminal, caught between childhood and adulthood, between her father's house and her husband's, between one identity and another, and around her waist was tied the cingulum, the knot of Hercules, and not only her husband could untie, on their wedding night, in their marriage bed. The symbolism wasn't subtle, her body was locked. He held the key. When evening came, the most public part of the ceremony began, the deductio in domum, the procession to the groom's house, and this is where Roman ritual stops looking ceremonial and starts looking like theatre of the macabre. Because this procession was deliberately designed to echo Rome's founding myth, the rape of the Sabine women. You know the story. Early Rome, desperate for women, invites the neighboring Sabines to a festival. At a prearranged signal, Roman men seize the Sabine women and drag them away to be wives. It's one of Rome's most famous legends, depicted in countless sculptures and frescoes. But here's the disturbing part. Romans didn't tell this story as a shameful origin. They celebrated it. They reenacted it. At every elite wedding, ancient writers describe the wedding procession using language that makes it sound like an abduction. Catullus, in his wedding poems, describes the groom seizing his bride. The bride was expected to display of pudor, modesty, shame, reluctance. She was supposed to cling to her mother, to hesitate, to be torn away in a mock struggle that everyone present understood to be performance, ritual resistance. But here's the question that should haunt us. When does performed fear become real fear? You're that 14-year-old girl. You've been told your entire life that this is normal, that this is what respectable women do. So you perform the resistance expected of you. You clutch your mother's arm. You hesitate at the door. You let yourself be pulled away while the crowd cheers. But you're also genuinely terrified. You're being handed over to a stranger. You're about to be taken to a house you've never seen. And everyone is smiling like this is beautiful. The performance and the reality become the same thing. As the procession wound through Rome's streets, crowds would gather, not just to watch, to participate. They sang verses feminine verses. Ancient sources describe these as obscene, vulgar, sexually explicit songs. They weren't gentle blessings. They were graphic. They were crude predictions about what would happen that night. Catullus's own wedding poetry includes lines so sexually explicit that Victorian translators left them in Latin. Roman writers claimed this served an apotropaic function. The vulgarity warded off evil spirits, jealous gods who might curse the marriage. Maybe. But let's think about this from the bride's perspective. You're being paraded through the streets of Rome, surrounded by strangers shouting sexual comments about your body, about what your husband will do to you in a few hours. You're 12, 13, 14 years old. This isn't celebration. This is psychological assault dressed up as tradition. Every element, the mock kidnapping, the expected fear, the public obscenity, reinforces the same message: your will, your comfort, your dignity no longer matter. You're being prepared for submission. The procession happened at night, lit by torches, the flickering firelight, the shadows on the faces of strangers, the noise, the chaos, all of it designed to overwhelm, to disorient, to mark this as a rupture, a point of no return. When the procession reached the groom's house, the bride was carried over the threshold. She wasn't allowed to walk. To stumble would be a terrible omen, so attendants lifted her and brought her inside. Ancient sources frame this as protective, preventing bad luck. But read it another way from the very first moment. She doesn't enter by her own power. She is brought in, passive, transferred. Once inside, standing in the atrium, the grand public heart of the Roman home, she would speak the ritual words. Se ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia, see. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. Gaius and Gaia weren't their real names. They were placeholder names, like saying John and Jane. But the formula is what matters. Not "I will follow you," not "I will support you," but "where you are, I am." Your location defines mine. Your identity subsumes mine. Scholars debate how universal this formula actually was. It might have been more literary ideal than universal practice, but the fact that it was held up as the ideal tells us everything. The bride was declaring the death of her separate existence. She was now an extension of her husband. What he was, she was. Where he was, she was. And this declaration happened in this atrium, the most public room in the entire house. This is where guests were received, where business was conducted, where the family shrine stood with wax masks of ancestors watching everything. And this is where the years electus genialis, the marriage bed, was displayed. Now, we need to be very careful here, because there's a persistent myth that consummation itself was a public spectacle, that guests would watch, that it was performance. Modern historians are skeptical of this. There's no solid evidence that consummation was literally witnessed. But here's what we do know. The marriage bed was placed in the atrium as a symbol of fertility and legitimacy. Whether the couple later retired to a private cubiculum, or whether the symbolic and the actual overlapped, is debated. But one thing is certain: privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Attendants waited nearby. The pronuba, the married woman who served as guide, was just outside. The bride knew people were close enough to hear. Remember the Knot of Hercules? This is when it was untied. Only the groom could untie it. Ancient sources describe this as a test of skill. If he struggled, it was a bad omen. If he untied it smoothly, prosperity and fertility would follow. But strip away the romantic framing. A grown man is ritually undressing a 14-year-old girl in a ceremony everyone understands to be the prelude to consummation. And the symbolism chosen is Hercules, the hero of conquest, the slayer of monsters, not tenderness, not partnership, conquest. Let me be very direct about what we're describing here. We're talking about a legal and social system that gave adult men in their 20s, 30s, sometimes older, access to the bodies of girls as young as 12. Girls who had not chosen their husbands, girls who had been handed over by their fathers in transactions that had nothing to do with affection or desire, and everything to do with property, politics, and power. Modern historians don't use euphemisms anymore. They use words like coercion. They use words like institutional abuse, because that's what this was. Roman law called it consensual. Roman religion called it sacred. Roman culture called it tradition. But no amount of ritual language changes the fundamental reality. Children were being given to adult men, and the entire weight of Roman society was structured to make that seem normal. The pronuba's role is especially telling. She was usually a married woman, often a relative, whose job was to guide the bride through the wedding night. Sources describe her as a comforting presence, someone who had survived this before and could offer reassurance. But think about what that role actually required. She was there to ensure the bride went through with it, to calm her if she panicked, to encourage her if she resisted, to make sure the transaction was completed. Some sources suggest she waited outside the door, not watching, but present, available, ready to intervene if necessary. Intervene how, for what? The sources don't say explicitly, but the implication is clear enough. Her role wasn't comfort, it was compliance. Now we come to the most controversial part of this story, and I need to be extremely careful here, because our only sources are deeply problematic. In his work, City of God, the Christian writer Augustine describes a pagan fertility cult involving a deity called Mutinus Titinus, a phallic god. According to Augustine, brides were required to sit on a representation of this god before their wedding night as a fertility rite. Here's the problem: Augustine was writing propaganda. His entire purpose was to make paganism look depraved to justify Christianity's takeover of Rome. And no pagan Roman writer, not one, ever describes this ritual. Not Ovid, not Catullus, not Martial, not Pliny. No one. So we have three possibilities. 1. It never happened. It's pure Christian fabrication. 2. It was a wildly distorted account of a much tamer ritual. 3. It was an extremely localized practice that wasn't widespread, and Christian writers seized on it because it fit their narrative. We genuinely don't know. So why mention it at all? Because even if it's false, even if it's complete propaganda, the fact that people believed, it tells us something crucial. It tells us that Roman wedding customs were already disturbing enough that this accusation seemed plausible. That educated people could hear this story and think, yes, that tracks with everything else Rome does to brides. Whether or not that specific ritual happened, We know for certain that Roman religious practice included explicit fertility rites. The Lupercalia, where men ran through streets striking women with goat hide strips to promote fertility. Phallic charms displayed in homes and streets as protective symbols. The cult of Priapus. Rome had a complex, often uncomfortable relationship between sexuality and religion. But let's set aside the uncertain claims. What we know for certain is damning enough. Roman marriage was a system engineered to break down female autonomy through ritual law and public performance. The mock-adduction, the obscene songs, the symbolic violence, the transfer of legal identity, the public placement of the marriage bed. Every single element reinforced the same lesson: your will doesn't matter. Your fear doesn't matter, your body is not your own. And here's what should disturb us most: this wasn't hidden. This wasn't secret. This was celebrated. Poets wrote about it. Lawyers codified it. Families planned for it. It was the social glue that held Rome together. Alliances forged, property consolidated, bloodlines secured, all on the bodies of girls too young to legally control their own lives. Some of you might be wondering, if these practices were so central to Roman life, why don't Roman historians write about them more? We have thousands of pages from Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny. They wrote exhaustively about wars, political scandals, imperial succession. But when it comes to the details of wedding nights, silence, vague references, euphemisms. The standard explanation is that these were domestic matters, women's matters, and male historians simply weren't interested. They focused on the public sphere, the forum, the Senate, the battlefield, and there's truth to that. But some historians suggest something else might have been happening. As Rome grew more sophisticated, as it absorbed Greek philosophy, as legal theory became more complex, certain archaic practices started to look embarrassing. The Romans loved to present themselves as the pinnacle of civilization, the people who brought law and order to a chaotic world. And yet here they were, still ritually reenacting the abduction of the Sabine women, still marrying 12-year-olds to 30-year-olds, still conducting ceremonies that looked more like trauma induction than sacred union. By the late Republic and early Empire, educated Romans may have been trying to distance themselves from these practices, keeping the rituals because tradition was sacred, but talking about them less because they were becoming aware of how they looked. When Christianity took over, the rewriting accelerated. Early Christians condemned pagan sexual practices, sometimes accurately, sometimes with wild exaggeration. Over time, Christian marriage ceremonies replaced pagan ones, the old rituals faded, and the memory of what actually happened became fuzzy, then uncertain, then almost mythological. By the medieval period, when European culture looked back to Rome as its cultural ancestor, there was a strong incentive to remember the good parts, the law, the engineering, the Stoic philosophy, and quietly forget the uncomfortable parts. The systematic control of women's bodies through marriage ritual, the legal frameworks that made children sexually available to adult men, the public ceremonies designed to psychologically break resistance. Those parts didn't fit the narrative of Rome as the glorious foundation of Western civilization, so they were soft-pedaled, euphemized, reframed as off their time, or just not discussed. But the evidence is still there, in legal codes, in poetry, in epitaphs, in archaeological remains, in the uncomfortable silences of historians who clearly knew more than they were willing to say. Here's why this matters. We're taught to revere Rome. Our legal systems, our governmental structures, our architecture, our rhetoric, they all trace back to Rome. When politicians talk about traditional values or classical civilization, Rome is what they mean: the Senate, the Republic, the rule of law. And if we're going to claim Rome as our cultural ancestor, we need to be honest about what that ancestry includes. Not just the Colosseum and the aqueducts, but the systematic control of women's bodies. Not just philosophy and law, but the legal frameworks that made child marriage normal. Not just military conquest, but the intimate violence dressed up as sacred tradition. History isn't just about celebrating achievements. It's about understanding how systems of power perpetuate themselves. And Roman marriage was a masterclass in social control. How to take a human being with will and autonomy and systematically dismantle those things until compliance seems natural, until submission seems sacred, until a 14-year-old girl being handed over to a 30-year-old stranger seems like a cause for celebration. The architecture of that control is still with us. The language of giving away the bride, the symbolism of thresholds and rings, the idea that marriage fundamentally transforms a woman's legal and social identity in ways it doesn't transform a man's. These aren't neutral traditions. They have origins, and those origins are in systems designed to transfer control of women from fathers to husbands. So the next time you see a romanticized painting of ancient Rome, marble statues, noble senators, flowing togas, remember what was happening in the homes. Remember the girls dressed with spear points. Remember the crowds singing obscenities as brides were paraded through streets. Remember the legal codes that defined consent in systems designed to make refusal impossible. Remember that power doesn't just express itself through armies and emperors. Sometimes the most absolute power is exercised in the most intimate moments, dressed up as love, blessed by religion, and then conveniently forgotten when it becomes uncomfortable to remember. The historical archives exists because forgetting is a choice, and remembering is resistance. If this changed how you see the foundations of Western civilization, subscribe, because there are countless more stories that empires built into their bedrock and then tried to bury. And we're going to find every single one. The girls in those wedding processions left almost no voices, but the systems that controlled them left extensive records. And those records tell a story that Rome, and every civilization that claimed Rome as its ancestor, would prefer you didn't hear. Now you've heard it. Don't let it be forgotten again.